My name is Karen Burton, and this is my presentation on how I would handle 3 different scenarios using the techniques I learned from the book Crucial Conversations, as well as other resources. Care, but not too much, from Bartlett County Community College. Rose Bauer works in reference, has a strong work ethic, pays attention to details, but can be a perfectionist at times. Fran Sweet works in the administrative offices and prefers to look at the big picture while leaving details to others. They have been longtime friends for about 10 years. During their friendship, Rose has previously noticed that Fran sometimes claims credit for things she hadn't developed, but Rose did not know it was part of a pattern, so she let it go and did not bring up the issue. Now, Rose and Fran have volunteered to work together on a subset of an important project. The library director has a goal of the library becoming more team-based and hopes that the project will be an example of achieving that goal. Rose created a timeline for the project, which included task completion dates and assignments, then shared it with Fran via email. Fran ignored it until Rose brought up the subject, then completed her part of the project. Then Fran emailed the entire project group, including the library director, and worded it so that Rose's contribution was not acknowledged, thus giving the impression Rose had not contributed anything to the project. Rose was furious, but decided to cool down before responding. One relevant issue is that Rose needs to learn to speak up the first time something happens, instead of letting an issue slide and having it develop into a bigger problem. She also needs to learn to involve others in creating a mutually agreed upon timeline for group projects, and to allow everyone, including herself, some leeway on those completion dates. Fran needs to learn to respect other people's time by paying attention to their communications about group projects. Fran also needs to be aware of how she words her communications and the impression she is giving of taking all the credit for herself and not acknowledging others' contributions. I do not think this situation requires gathering additional information. It seems to clearly be about differing expectations between two parties and each party neither receiving nor giving clear communication about those expectations. So there are several things in the Crucial Conversations book that could be used to resolve this situation. Chapter 5 discussed establishing mutual purpose. Rose needs to initiate a crucial conversation with Fran, and during that conversation, Rose could accomplish establishing mutual purpose by talking about both her and Fran wanting this project to succeed, thus preserving their working relationship and friendship. Chapter 6 of Crucial Conversations discuss mastering your stories and retracing your path. Rose needs to analyze her story and stick to the facts of the behaviors she sees from Fran. For example, Rose previously noticed that Fran neglected to acknowledge other people's contributions to collaborative projects when she communicated with her supervisors. Rose needs to ask herself what she really wants. Does she want acknowledgement of her contributions? Does she want to feel like her efforts to shuffle her work and personal life around to complete her tasks on time were valued? Does she want to not feel like she's being ignored? Rose also needs to ask for Fran's path regarding acknowledgement of others' contributions. Is Fran doing this on purpose, or does she even realize the impression that she gives with how she words her emails and other communications? Chapter 7 of Crucial Conversations discusses how to state your path. Rose needs to tell her story and explain that she feels her contributions are not acknowledged, her efforts are not valued, and she is not being listened to. Then Rose needs to ask for Fran's path, paraphrase what she hears to be sure that Rose is understanding, and she can also compare Fran's viewpoint with hers. So my overall strategy for resolving the matter would be to have Rose initiate a conversation with Fran regarding Rose's frustration with how they worked together on their project, and how Rose felt Fran took all the credit for the project. The advantage is that the issues Rose has avoided talking about will be out in the open for discussion. The disadvantage is that if the conversation does not go well, their friendship and working relationship could be damaged. One goal for my decision is that both Rose and Fran clearly state their expectations regarding working together on a project and collaboratively create and agree on a timeline for completing their project and a format for presenting it that acknowledges everyone's contributions. Other goals are that Rose learns to involve other people in the planning process and Fran learns to acknowledge her colleagues' contributions. I think the best option to resolve the matter would be for Rose and Fran to come to a consensus on how they will handle working together in the future and acknowledging each other's contributions. They also need to both commit to who does what task by when and to regular check-ins with each other for accountability. My final decision is that Rose needs to prepare for and initiate a crucial conversation with Fran regarding how they work together and acknowledgement of Rose's contribution to the project. If they do not have this conversation, Rose will continue to feel ignored and frustrated, and the issues will eventually boil over with more severe consequences. I would evaluate the effectiveness of my decision by looking at how Rose and Fran work together on the next collaborative project. I would look for a mutually agreed upon timeline and if they were holding each other accountable to it. I would specifically look at if Rose is speaking up the first time Fran doesn't meet a deadline, instead of letting it slide until the problem is worse. I would also look at how they both choose to communicate with supervisors and if all contributing parties are being acknowledged. If Rose and Fran are not able to resolve their differences, their working relationship and friendship will suffer and they will not be as effective at their jobs. This could result in both a strained work environment and loss of productivity for the library as a whole. Case 16. To use or not to use volunteers from Express Information Services, LLC. Lisa Collins is the supervisor of a state park with no budget for hiring additional personnel, but a room full of historical records that need to be cataloged. Visitors have repeatedly asked for exhibits on the history of the state park, so Lisa asked her friend Ann Baxter to come assess the historical materials. Ann agreed to do this, resulting in the recommendation that Lisa hire an archivist to work with the collection. Lisa does not have the budget, so Ann agreed to post on several discussion lists for a volunteer with experience in archiving. Ann was shocked by the negative responses to her postings and is not sure what to tell her friend Lisa. The main issues are Lisa's unrealistic expectations of finding a highly skilled volunteer willing to catalog the materials, and Ann's uncertainty about how to tell Lisa the unfavorable responses to requests for a volunteer. Another issue is preserving their friendship if Lisa feels that Ann let her down by not finding a volunteer. There is additional information that both Ann and Lisa should gather. Ann could reach out to MLIS students interested in archival studies to see if one of them would be interested in cataloging the state park's historical documents as a project or an internship. Lisa could look into any grants available for funding a temporary archivist position and clarify exactly what she wants the end result of the project to be. Ann might also provide Lisa with some archivist contacts who could assess the project more thoroughly and give Lisa a better idea of the scope of the project. I found a quote from the article, Climbing Peaks and Navigating Valleys, Managing Personnel from High Altitude, that I thought tied into the Crucial Conversations book, which is all about creating dialogue. It says, good communication can be the single greatest problem solver when people work together, and a failure to communicate can be an equally significant source of difficulties. In this scenario, there are several techniques from Crucial Conversations that Ann could use to have a crucial conversation with Lisa. Chapter 3 talks about defining what you really want. Ann needs to ask herself what she really does and does not want. Does she want to help Lisa with her problem? Does Ann want to not feel like she is responsible for solving Lisa's problem? Does Ann want to avoid damaging her and Lisa's friendship? Chapter 4 talks about establishing mutual purpose. In this scenario, it could be having Lisa find the resources she needs to have the historical materials cataloged. Another mutual purpose would be keeping Ann and Lisa's friendship intact. Ann could also use contrasting when talking with Lisa. For example, saying, "I do want to help you, but I don't want to feel responsible for the outcome." Chapter 5 talks about brainstorming new strategies. In this case, Lisa could search for an archival student who needs to do a project or internship. She could also look for grants to fund an archivist position and apply for them. Chapter 6 talks about exploring each other's paths. In this scenario, Lisa needs to understand that Anne can't solve her problem for her, and Anne needs to understand Lisa's frustration with her situation and lack of funding. My overall strategy for resolving the matter is to have Anne have a crucial conversation with Lisa about defining what she really wants in terms of having the historical materials cataloged, and brainstorming ways she could accomplish this, while also making it clear that this task is Lisa's responsibility, not Anne's. The advantage is that this will help transfer the responsibility to Lisa and preserve their friendship because Lisa will feel that Anne has helped her. The main goal for my decision is to provide Lisa with a path forward towards getting the historical materials cataloged. A secondary goal is preserving Lisa and Anne's friendship by having Lisa feel that Anne has helped her and not let her down. One option is that Anne tells Lisa she could not find any volunteers and leaves it at that, but that would result in Lisa not getting the historical materials cataloged. The disadvantage of that outcome is it would damage their friendship because Lisa could easily feel that Anne let her down. But the advantage is that Anne no longer has to put her personal efforts into solving Lisa's problem. A better option is that Anne reaches out to her personal contacts to see if anyone is willing to talk to Lisa about taking on the project as a volunteer, then transfers communication to Lisa. This would result in Lisa feeling like Anne is trying to help her and possibly finding an archivist willing to volunteer. The advantage is that a personal request may yield better results than a discussion board post. The disadvantage is that Anne may receive the same negative responses she originally did. My final decision is that Anne needs to have a crucial conversation with Lisa about her expectations for finding a volunteer archivist and what part Anne can play in that. Lisa also needs to define exactly what she wants the end result of the cataloging project to be, and take charge of searching for someone to take it on herself instead of putting that burden solely on Anne. I recommend these actions because it clearly defines expectations and roles for both parties and puts the initiative for solving the problem in the hands of Lisa, who retains ownership for the state park she manages. These actions also absolve Anne of responsibility for finding an archivist, which needs to happen because staying involved in the situation could damage her and Lisa's friendship. I would measure the effectiveness of my decision by if Lisa was able to define what she wanted and successfully find someone to perform those duties. I would evaluate the effectiveness of the decision by seeing if Lisa was able to get someone to catalog the historical records, as well as looking at the state of Anne and Lisa's friendship. Case 18. Friends or sexual harassment? Who decides? From Johnsonville State University. Joyce Blaine is an adult student with 2 grown children who has returned to college and accepted a part-time job in the campus library. Ned Parker is the head of reference at the campus library and Joyce's supervisor. They began eating lunch together regularly and had dinner together when they ran into each other outside work. They became involved enough that they held hands and touched at work. Sandra Labas is a library employee well known for her overzealous observations of students, and she is especially fond of telling students to stop being affectionate with each other. Sandra observes Joyce and Ned being affectionate and begins telling other staff members Ned is sexually harassing Joyce. Sandra tells the other library employees that if she is uncomfortable seeing Ned and Joyce be affectionate, that can have legal implications and threatens to report this to the library dean and HR. One issue in this scenario is if Joyce and Ned's relationship violates university policy or not. The usual objection to staff-student relationships is the age difference and therefore power imbalance. The scenario implies that both Joyce and Ned are in each other's peer group regarding age and educational areas, but he is still her supervisor. The other issue is that Sandra has repeatedly shown a pattern of intrusively observing students and has transferred that interference to Joyce and Ned. The scenario makes no mention of anyone else being bothered by their relationship, nor that their displays of affection are gratuitous, so Sandra's discomfort appears to be internally generated. There are several questions that need to be answered in order to handle this scenario. First, what is university policy on relationships in the workplace between students and staff? Does it take into account both parties' ages? Also, what does the university's sexual harassment policy say? Does it contain wording that implies a party who is not directly involved, like Sandra, may bring legal action? This information should be easily acquired from university officials or HR. There are several chapters in Crucial Conversations that are useful in this scenario. Chapter 10 talks about tough situations. One example given there is if the situation is touchy and personal, like the scenario is, start by describing specific behaviors, then move to solutions. Sandra's repeated intrusive behavior is causing students to have an unpleasant experience when they visit the library, which could lead to a decline in library use. If Joyce and Ned's relationship does not violate university policy, then she needs to keep her opinions to herself. Chapter 3 talks about refusing the sucker's choice, which is when someone loses. Don't let one party losing be the only outcome. Be creative. Find a third option that creates a positive outcome for everyone. Which leads to Chapter 5, a mutual purpose. If you don't have one, invent one. Often looking at bigger goals everyone agrees with is a good place to start. Perhaps in this case, library goals would be a good place to start. Having a pleasant and safe work environment, good experience for students when they visit the library. That makes it not just about one party's behavior, but how they fit into the big picture. Chapter 6 warns to watch for clever stories that detract from staying in dialogue. In this scenario, Sandra may see herself as the victim and Ned as the villain. Management Basics for Information Professionals also contains a chapter on motivation. In this scenario, finding out what is motivating Sandra's intrusive behavior could be very helpful, because then you could use positive reinforcement to modify it. Perhaps an incentive could be knowing she is contributing to a student's positive library experience, therefore encouraging them to use the library more often. My overall strategy for resolving the matter would be for both Ned's supervisor and Sandra's supervisor to be made aware of the situation and handle it together. They should research university policy on staff-student relationships to see if Ned and Joyce's relationship violates any of them. The supervisors should also answer the question of if Sandra's discomfort is sufficient to bring legal action against the university. This also may involve consulting one of the university lawyers or outside counsel. Once the supervisors have that information, they can decide whether to have a crucial conversation with Ned, Sandra, or both. The main goal for my decision would be to prevent any legal action being taken against the university for violating either university policy on staff-student relationships or the university sexual harassment policy. Another goal would be to preserve good employee relations and student experience at the library by having Sandra modify her behavior to a less intrusive model. There are multiple options for resolving the matter, and which one is chosen depends on university policy. If university policy prohibits all relationships between staff and students, then Joyce and Ned will need to suspend their personal relationship until Joyce has graduated, which would result in them avoiding legal consequences. The disadvantage of that option is that Joyce and Ned would lose a relationship they both enjoy, but they would no longer be violating university policy. If university policy only prohibits relationships between supervisors and subordinates, perhaps Joyce could find another part-time job, or Ned could pass his supervisory duties to another librarian. This would result in them being able to continue their relationship in a way that does not violate university policy. That option has the advantage of preserving their relationship, but the disadvantage of one of them having to change their employment or job duties. If Sandra's discomfort is not sufficient to warrant any legal action, then Sandra's supervisor needs to have a conversation with her about ceasing her repeated pattern of overly intrusive behavior and not discussing other people's relationships with staff members. This could result in Sandra no longer interfering with Joyce and Ned's relationship and Sandra having better relationships with her coworkers. And all of these options follow that mutual purpose of a good library experience. My final decision is that Joyce and Ned need to be made aware of university policy on staff-student relationships by Ned's supervisor and follow it. Failure of their supervisor to address this issue could result in an expensive lawsuit being brought against the university, as well as affecting the library's public image. Another part of my decision is that Sandra's supervisor needs to address her repeated behavior pattern of overzealous and intrusive monitoring of library patrons and gossiping. This unpleasant behavior affects how users view their library experience and could lead to decreased library usage or negatively affect users' perceptions of the library. I would measure the effectiveness of my decision by the compliance of Joyce, Ned, and Sandra with the requirements their supervisors set. I could also evaluate Sandra's compliance with the required behavior changes by monitoring what students say about their library experience through social media postings or what other librarians overhear. Consequences could include no threat of legal action regarding Joyce and Ned's relationship and a better library experience for both employees and students. From textbooks to journal articles, there are many resources available regarding the difficult conversations we will all eventually take part in. I think the book Crucial Conversations provides a wealth of resources for initiating and navigating the difficult discussions we will all need to have in both our professional and personal lives.